We are live, Myth Vision podcast. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Hit the like button. I hope you'll stay tuned as many people in the online arena that have engaged in apologetics, counter apologetics, like I've done, have come across presuppositionalist in various forms. And to me, it feels that much of the argumentation is to undermine anything and everything you ever bring up. It doesn't matter how much empirical data you show of contradictory material, how human the Bible is, how flawed the deity of the Bible is. It doesn't matter what you do with any case of empirical data, observation, anything. What I find is that they go, explain reason and logic. Sorry, I got a little echo here. So they'll start with reason and logic, and you're undermining your own thing to assume you can even make a case that makes sense to show the flaws and problems. So it's this weird mental gymnastic game that sounds a bit circular. And so I said, look, I'm not a philosopher. I was a presuppositionalist as a Christian. What that entailed as a Protestant was that the word of God was where truth came from. And you start with that. You don't challenge it. It's not filled with contradiction. It is true. And this is the revelation of God. And from there, I built my worldview. So I was that kind of presuppositionalist without being aware of philosophy, without knowing all the lingo, without the script that you find presuppositionalist online. And I guess I was a soft presup in the sense that I held to that, but I would dabble in empirical argumentation. Ravi Zacharias, William Lane Craig, several other apologists were very influential to me. But today, I'm bringing on a professional philosopher. Dr. Alex Malpass will be joining us to discuss presuppositional apologetics. Maybe we'll dabble into some of the actual philosophy behind this whole presuppositional idea. Why is this thing online? And on and on. And with that being said, let's go ahead and introduce our guest. Sorry for the long-winded intro, Alex. Welcome, Dr. Malpass.
Hi. I guess I don't know if I'm a professional philosopher or not. I mean, it depends what you mean, right? I don't have an academic position at a university, so if that's the criteria, then technically that's wrong, right? I'm not an academic in that sense, but I have a PhD in philosophy and publish still as frequently as I can in the field. So depends what you mean, doesn't it? I just don't want to give people the wrong impression by that.
I get it.
So, yeah.
Well, you've done quite a bit of work. You have your PhD in the field of philosophy. You are well aware and acquainted with philosophical ideas that are taken serious in the field. Mm-hmm. And then you're also somebody who I've noticed has engaged with the non-academic arena online pertaining to what they would consider themselves philosophers in some way. And maybe they are in some way, but they're not taken serious, as you've pointed out to me, in like actual academia pertaining to philosophical thought. So I don't want to coercively force the path that we need to go down with this particular thing, because you're way better acquainted not only with the actual philosophy, which I'm ignorant of. Ultimately, I can navigate it with you. I can follow you. I can track your argumentation. I just don't speak philosophy language. If you talk history, you talk mythology, you talk literature, physical, empirical, observational, material things, I'm there. Mental masturbation is what I call a lot of philosophy. And I don't mean it in a derogatory sense, but sometimes I do, because I think that a lot of them are like, look over here. And it's like, you haven't done anything. Well, what are your words doing but making everyone think you're smarter than what you are by playing word games and not dealing with the data? You probably brought some things, some ideas, and we're going to have an open dialogue. So wherever you want to start, let's begin.
Okay, well, I mean, I think the reason that you reached out to me in the first place was, I'm going to turn dings off on this thing. Here we go. So I think the reason you reached out to me in the first place was because you had this run-in on a presup. Was it Discord or something where you were chatting with some guys? YouTube.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then you got dogpiled a little bit, and yeah. So I consider you to be a survivor in that sense. So I feel your pain. It's very difficult, I think, if you get dogpiled by a bunch of people who pull out the lingo and they are super uncharitable and interrupt you continuously and whatever. So I'm happy to help give a counterpoint to that, I guess. I like to think of myself as being quite charitable and reasonable and stuff. So hopefully there'll be a counterpoint in attitudinal sense as well as the specifically the words. So I listened to it again today, just a little while back, and it was a classic case of just. Do we want to post a link to it? I don't know if you want to promote that channel or.
I don't mind.
If you wanted to, people can search for it and find it anyway.
Yeah, they can find it. So it's on Made by Jim Bob's channel. The full thing, and it was like 4 hours. And like I expressed, look, I went into this good faith dialogue interested in actually, getting to hear a conversation between non-Christians and Christians. And you could see some of the games I felt were games. Like, do you believe in miracles? They asked me. And I was like, no, I don't believe in miracles. And they were like, well, it was some, here it is. So it was some, I'm not going to, do you have a section you want me to play, or do you want me to just show the screen?
No, not really. No.
So it was like this word game of like, explain the law. I can't even remember. It was like the laws of nature or some particular thing, like explain it. It was a presuppositional kind of gotcha thing. And if you can't explain that using your rationale, then it's just asserted you have something metaphysical that is miraculous or something to this effect. And I was like, I don't get how that's a miracle, or how you've now made me believe in miracles. It's like word games to make you convinced. And while I don't have my whole, what they would consider worldview figured out, it changes as I learn, as I continue to go in terms of understanding. I don't know the answer. Like, why is there something rather than nothing? I just assume brute fact. I don't know. I don't pretend. And something about the teleological or these transcendental arguments are like, they want certainty. They need confidence and certainty instead of being totally open to, if there was a God, then there might be a God. I'm not convinced. I'm not persuaded. Anyway, sorry.
Okay, so maybe we start at the beginning and I was like, what are we talking about, right? Because not everyone's familiar with it, and some people may have bumped into it without really getting what's going on. So, right. I mean, I don't want to be, I don't want to go back too far, but let's just say a few words about, like, what do we mean by apologetics in general to begin with, right? A topic the viewers of your channel are surely familiar with, but it's, what's the point of apologetics? Why is it different to philosophy, say? One of the things that's different about it might involve philosophical concepts and it seems type of presenting arguments, that type of thing. But there's a big difference in the sense that, like, apologetics is primarily supposed to be like a defense of the faith. It's a classic way of people explaining what apologetics is. So it's very much arguing for a specific position. So it's not a disinterested engagement with evidence or arguments. It's an interested engagement with evidence and arguments. You're trying to, back up a certain position, right? That's what apologetics is. So you could be an apologist for, veganism or the conservative politics or Christianity or atheism, right? You can be an apologist for anything. But in particular, it means you've got a position, you're defending that position. And in particular, when it comes to Christian apologetics, often it means you're trying to convert the other person to your position. You're winning souls for Jesus or whatever. So it's a bit like, though potentially it's somewhat uncharitable, but it's a bit like being a car salesman, right? Because you've got an objective, you're trying to get the guy to agree with you so that, they part with your money, with their money, and you make a sale or whatever. So there's some, it's not just a simple curious person engaging with something and just sort of figuring it out for themselves, right? And if you are a curious person, open to ideas and thinking about stuff, then your experience of bumping into an apologist can be a bit like your experience of wandering into a secondhand car dealership and being accosted by a salesman, right? Because he's going to start trying to talk to you and get you to do the thing that pays their wages or something. So that's, in a general sense, that's what apologetics is. And it's, like as I said, it's not necessarily a religious idea, but it often is. And I think if we zoom in a little bit more on this kind of Christian apologetics, there's a sort of taxonomy that you'll hear presuppositionalists themselves give about how they distinguish themselves from the rest of the field, right? Which is that often you've got evidential apologetics. So
Mhm.
typically you'll find people talking about like the complexity of biological systems, or the fine tuning of the universe, or whatever, stuff like that, where they really are digging into scientific stuff and using that to make their case. So it's very much about the evidence. And then often you get let's say something like a priori apologetics, where this is, abstract arguments, things like the ontological argument, God is by definition a perfect being, and perfect being, must exist, that type of thing, right? In both cases, what they're doing is presenting arguments. Maybe they're deductive arguments or inductive arguments or whatever, but they are playing the game of argument giving and assuming that when you're giving an argument, you try and present premises that your interlocutor probably agrees with in order to tease out consequences that they should also accept, right? So there's this kind of central idea that there's some common ground somewhere. And if you start there, you lead them towards where you want them to go from the position that they agree with. The presuppositionalist sort of just doesn't want to be in either of those camps. They don't want to give evidence, right? And often this is biographical description of some people who become presuppositionalists, is that they get kind of fed up with discussing the evidence. They want to talk about something, they want to shortcut straight to where the interesting stuff happens, which means where they win, right? And they don't want to talk about the evidence. And I think it's very much what happened to you, because you wanted to, at least a little bit of the debate that I saw, you were talking about textual this and historical that and stuff,
Right.
and that's all about fine evaluations of the evidence and whatnot. And I felt like, at least in the bit that I watched, a couple of guys rushed you, and they were basically like, "Yeah, forget all that evidence stuff. How do you, account for reason or something?"
If you can't explain this,
Yeah,
screw everything you have to say. And I told you, just to make it's worth reading just for fun for our audience, if you don't mind. My buddy, Dr. Richard C. Miller, who is acquainted with philosophical thought, he's way better acquainted than I am, of course, pertaining to this. And he saw the entire exchange. By the way, in the private chat, I was messaging them about 2 hours in. I'm hungry. Dinner's ready. I need to go. Usually when you're on a channel, someone will find a way to pivot that and go, "Thanks for your time. I appreciate it. Time to go." We went another 2 hours. I'm trying not to bounce and just leave because I'm the guest. But it went for another 2 hours. And by then I'm irritated. I'm irritable. I'm at this point, I'm like ready to go. So he comments, I guess someone was like, "You got smashed. Derek had no answer for justifying all, actual reason and actual logic without having that ultimate origin of God." That's pretty much the point. So then Richard Miller wrote, "I didn't see that happen at all. I saw a guy who took 2 night classes at a no-name college in epistemology abusing a more learned and accomplished guest who happened not to have taken any courses in epistemology. Derek has no need to defend or even articulate epistemic warrants for secular research and scholarship. The stupidity," of course, this is Jay Dyer that he's remarking on. "Instead of showering Derek with respect or hosting a successful show that brings on many of the top living academicians as guests sharing their research, he plays this clown game with epistemology. It's like this is the point. This is what I liked that I thought was interesting. And this is the whole, I even was reading something about Van Til that kind of hints at this, that these reform type of epistemologists / precept guys that are doing this, he's like, it's like asking the next Tour de France cyclist winner to explain and to rationalize the engineering physics of his bicycle, or somehow he should be shamed and given no trophy. Extremely stupid and disgraceful." So I was reading a paper that I think, who wrote this? You probably read it. Van Til versus Stroud. It's really, I think, is well written. The author is, I'll probably butcher this, Balint Bekefi. Anyway, I thought it was a really well written, helped me get acquainted more with like Van Til and some of these ideas that are being postulated. And it's like they have this thing that's like, you undermine anything that the skeptic says, and in doing so, even if the skeptic makes sense, you still win. Even if I could show you the Bible's full of contradictions, God is literally a man-made abstract idea of the ancient mind of these people from a particular tribe at a region in the world in which superstition runs rampant, et cetera, does not matter because it made sense. If it simply makes sense, then we have logic and God on our side, and you can't prove how logic it's so insane. I've never thought that it would be that dumb that you can prove to me something with really good confidence based on empirical data and then turn around and reverse and go, cool, we still win because everything you said made sense. And if you can't explain where making sense comes from, we can. Right. God. It's insane. I've never heard anything like this on this level. Even when I was a pre-sup as a Christian, I didn't know it went this, this deep.
Mm-hmm. So it's basically like the other two, like the evidentialist and the I actually don't even know what the technical term is, a priorist or whatever, the person who's giving his abstract arguments. Both of those are, as I said, playing by some kind of like normal common rules of engagement where you assume common ground and you try and move the person gently from their position towards yours or something. The presuppositionalist has a kind of much more radical take on all of this, right? So they're generally going to just go straight to where they think is a much more profound level of analysis, where it's like, you might have proved, using an argument that such and such is true, but there couldn't be arguments unless God existed, right? And then it's just like, okay, so we can't assume common ground on the basis of like logic just being something that we share. That's like that's not one of the things that's in dispute between us. But now all of a sudden it is, and not only that, but there's this very strong claim, this preposterously strong claim, if you ask me, that unless like the triune God of Christianity, whatever their version of Christianity is,
right,
existed, then logic and reasoning would be impossible. And then that's where it kind of just sort of undermines most people's space in which they operate when they're talking to people about religion. Loads of stuff is taken for granted. These guys are trying to call into question things that normally you don't think about. So, for instance, most people have never considered what the metaphysics of logic is, or metaphysics of mathematics or something. It's a very obscure, right. Well, why would most people do that? Because it's got nothing to do with really, unless you're very strange. It's the sort of question that you don't dwell on very much. I mean, you might occasionally go, I wonder what numbers are, and then just move on to like what you're having for dinner or something more important than that. So anyway, typically speaking, I mean, we're talking street level interactions here. Typically, it's not particularly profound. It's a kind of gotcha thing. It's a thing where like there are no, I've never encountered a female presuppositionalist, right? It's just a man thing, right? It's a thing that men do to try and look like the big man, to beat up the other guy, and like it's verbal combat or whatever. Yeah, it's tempting to say this is, doesn't really matter. It's just a kind of adolescent guy thing that people do.
Right.
There is some academics who, Van Til was a theologian, a noteworthy theologian. He has a bunch of like inheritance that's come down to us in the form of other people that he influenced. Greg Banson, I don't know, John Frame, Rush Dooney. I don't know. There's some other people, right? It probably has a reasonably large influence in certain bits of American Reformed theology stuff. You probably encounter much more than I do in a cultural sense, right? But we can talk about the intellectual origins of where it came from and what the philosophical ideas that it's in the neighborhood of are, if you want to have an intellectual conversation about those types of things, or we can have fun talking about the kind of gotcha tactics that YouTube people use, or whatever you like, really.
Yeah, I figure we'll freestyle it. Of course, I want to keep it in the fun range. We were talking about whether or not we wanted this to be academic as much or fun. And I figure it might be interesting to note some along the way. You might say, hey, pin this. This is an academic idea that is taken serious by pre-subs if you want. But I kind of wanted to keep it in the online area because I kind of want this to be a go-to video for those who encounter this kind of stuff, that word game combat that you've seen, and oftentimes by people who, if they talked like that on a regular basis, I honestly would not know who they are in this world. I would have no interest in befriending them or even getting to know who these people are. If that's how they were in real life, I feel bad for the partners, because I can't imagine the arguments they go through if things go south. Because it just makes me think, oh my gosh. So I think that we can stay in the online realm, if that's okay with you.
Of course, yeah.
One of the interesting things I did notice too, that we're back to kind of serious theologian Van Til, where the notion of presuppositionalism was kind of an argument that's kind of coupled with the tulip concept in Calvinism, because the human, in their view, is completely a wretch and completely incapable of divine revelation from God unless God births the Spirit in them, making them born again, making them a living creature of God, and then they're capable of grasping. So they think it's futile to make evidentialist arguments with skeptics and non-believers due to their presuppositional idea that humans are incapable of having any influential mind changing without the Spirit involving it. And so that's an interesting thing. These other guys that I've encountered online take an angle where they laugh at precepts that are not Orthodox Christians, and they like literally say, we don't care, you can mock them, we think they're as wrong as can all get out and stuff. It's really interesting. Have you seen that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that broadly speaking, presuppositionalism really has nothing to do with the details of Christianity whatsoever, right? It's always it's like top heavy presup. It's all about like attacking your view, and hardly ever really about defending their own view, right? So the difference between Orthodox Christianity and Reformed Christianity just doesn't come into it, because they don't spend any time really spelling out any of those distinctions at all. And when they do, they're not being precepts anymore. They're talking about, well, it says this in the Bible, we've got this church father, blah, blah, blah. They're interdisciplinary discussions with one another. They're not precept. Precept is a technique designed explicitly, I think it's a quote from Banson, to shut the mouth of the unbeliever, right? That's what this is about. It's not supposed to be like, like I said, it's not a disinterested philosophical engagement. This is an interested philosophical engagement. It has a particular angle in mind. And I've often thought, really, because I guess it shuts the mouth of the unbeliever in a certain sense, but actually, I think probably what it's trying to do is to reassure the minds of the possibly wavering people in the congregation, right? Mm-hmm. That's actually what's going on here. It's not converting people to Jesus, because it never converts anybody to anything. Maybe it shuts them up when they're talking about it, but really what's going on is the audience member who's watching their champion look like a champion in front of the unbeliever, and it makes them feel better about them. As a result of that, it makes them feel more comfortable in their religious perspective. So that
debate you sent me of Bahnsen and Stein, one of the top comments that registered was, "Thank you. I now have confidence." Like it literally was reassuring that person based on this debate, which ended badly for Stein. He didn't look as good rhetorically in this debate.
Stein got crushed 100%.
He got crushed rhetorically, but see how it's rhetorical. And this is why engaging in debates, for me, I don't personally enjoy me being involved. I'm not interested in doing it because of this. But yeah, so you're saying that's where it popularized this online apologetics.
100%. Yeah, it seems to me that Stein-Banson debate, which I think is in the 80s, maybe early 90s, but it's around that time period, and it's before the internet really. There's no social media. They weren't live streaming this. It's just a college debate that was recorded on like a tape recorder or whatever. But that has become an infamous debate because it's where. Stein is like a nobody, really. Probably you've never heard of Gordon Stein before you listen to that video, but he's just this generic kind of, I think he's a biologist, and so he's a bit like a Richard Dawkins kind of dude who's going around to college campuses and debating people on evolution and stuff like this. And I just think he wasn't prepared. He didn't know about the transcendental argument, the transcendental approach, whatever, the precept stuff. And Banson, who has a PhD from A reputable American university in California. I don't think it's Berkeley, but whatever. He has a decent credentials as a philosopher, but also has a master's degree in theology, and I think by Van Til. I think Van Til was
Hmm.
his like supervisor or whatever. So he's directly in this lineage. So he's fully guns blazing pre-sup guy, right? And just asks questions that that Stein has no good answers to, and they're typically things like I think one of the main gotcha moments is about whether the laws of logic exist or something, right? Whether
Right.
there can be non-material objects and stuff like this. And Stein's all over the place, doesn't really get it. He's a standard atheist, materialist guy who's really into science and not into philosophy. So
Right.
he's getting pwned by this debate. And I think a lot of people watch that and maybe grew up or were teenagers or something. And there's a good generation of people who think that that's the defining way of doing debates and being Christian online, and it's an ultra strong macho way of debating. So yeah, I think a lot of it goes back to that. So you think of your favorite internet pre-sup troll. They probably had a big awakening moment when they heard this and were like, "Oh, that's how I want to be online," right? Like poning the atheist and making him feel like he's an idiot or something. Not polite, engagement, sort of refined discussion of ideas, but like poning somebody. So that's where I think a lot of it goes back to kind of like contemporary history. I think you can trace a lot of this phenomena that we're talking about today back to, I guess, the publication of that online at some point, like probably in the early noughties or something. And that's somewhere where I first encountered it was probably like 2010 or 2012 or something like that.
Right. So, as far as these gotcha questions, can you
Mm.
explain the laws of, do you believe they exist, these metaphysical laws of logic or laws of physics or laws, whatever it may be? How do you, as a philosopher, engage these kind of things, giving our audience some tools so that when they encounter these word games, I call them word games because it's gotcha questions, how would you answer this as someone who's thought through philosophy for quite some time? And I know this is exiting the online rubbish and asking you your own answer, so to speak, of how you would encounter this and how you would,
Right.
address it. And it's no sweat off your back. None of these are gotchas to you as a philosopher who understands and knows what this is.
Yeah. Okay. So first of all, the reason why it's not particularly worrying is because I think there's basically a big burden shift going on with these types of strategies, right? And the reason for that is typically your presuppositionalist is the one who's making an argument. They have their own type of argument. It's called the transcendental argument. So it's not the Kalam, it's not the design argument, it's not the fine-tuning argument or something. It's a transcendental argument. It's a different type of argument. But ultimately, they're the one making that argument, right? So there's a type of responsibility, kind of rational obligation that's incumbent upon somebody who's making an argument to defend the premises of the argument. If you're going to say, all fish are called Stephen, this is a fish, therefore he's called Stephen. What do you mean all fish are called Stephen? What are you talking about, right? If you've made the argument, you have to defend that weird looking premise. Right? It's not
Right.
about me showing that there's some fish that's not called Stephen, right? It's not my problem. You're the guy who said that they're all called Stephen, so you have to do something about it, right? It's just obvious, straightforward debating. Like, it's not really rules, it's just like, this is how it works. Otherwise, you're giving away advantages and not doing it rigorously or whatever. So the presuppositionalist is typically in a position of making an argument like this, right? They're going to say something like, unless God existed, logic would be impossible, something
Mhm.
like this. Right? I might word it slightly differently, but come to the same thing. But logic obviously isn't impossible because here you are using it in an argument. So that must mean that God exists, right? That's the basic structure of the argument. Now,
Right.
if you're engaged in a discussion like that, then they're making that claim, and there's always going to be one very implausible claim, which is this idea of, unless God existed, whatever it is, X would be impossible. I'd say logic, typically, or mathematics, or reasoning, or epistemology, whatever, something like that you are not committed to the impossibility of, at the very least, probably committed to the possibility of. And unless you're careful, it's very easy to get steamrolled into thinking that you have to explain what logic is or what
Right.
reason is or something like that. But if you think about it, they're the ones who are saying, unless God existed, this thing would be impossible.
They're making
I
the
just want
claim.
to hear what the argument is for that claim, right? That's what you should do, is just sort of take a step back, take a deep breath, just ask them, you make an interesting claim here. Explain that to me. How does that work? Keep the focus on them. They're the person making the weird claim. Don't let them say, and typically what they'll say is, look, I know that claim is true because of the impossibility of the contrary, right? Which is to say, the other views are impossible. So my view must be true by default. And then
Right.
that shifts the burden onto you saying, well, I don't think the other views are impossible. What about blah, blah, blah? And you try and like give some token example of maybe reason is this thing or something. And then you're defending when they should be defending, basically. So I guess the golden rule when discussing this type of stuff with a presuppositionist is keeping straight where the burden of the responsibility is. Like, who's defending the argument right now? And
Right.
unless you're making an objective, unless you've got some pet theory about the metaphysics of logic and you're proactively pushing that on somebody else, it's not going to be you defending that, right? If you suddenly find yourself somehow defending a view you've never thought about before, that's a big red flag that something's gone wrong in the discussion.
Right.
It's probably because they have done a switcheroo on you, where they start off making an argument, and somehow you have to defend something, otherwise their premise is true, right? And that's just a kind of fallacy. It's a kind of it's a shifting of the burden of responsibility from where it should be to the other guy, right? And then it's like, unless you've got some answer to what logic is, they win. I mean, it's crazy when you put it like this, but like that's actually what's going on. It's just really difficult in the moment, especially if someone's being belligerent, not letting you finish, talking down to you, throwing in terms that you're not particularly familiar with, or historical references, say, I don't know, Anaximander or whatever, just randomly dropped into a conversation for no reason. These types of things can just like keep you off your guard, and you don't really. But
Right.
often when you listen back, you start thinking, I didn't bring that up. He brought that up, but somehow I'm defending some random view that I never really thought about before. And all of a sudden I have to defend some view about it. And I think this happened to you. It was very natural that it would happen, but you ended up sort of going, I guess, laws of logic are like conventions or something, man-made things, blah, blah, blah. And then often they have a script, because there's only that many options for, a layperson talking about this off the top of their head. They're not going to come up with a completely novel perspective. So you probably land in one or two like obvious buckets, and then they've just got a script there. So if you ever say anything like it's man-made or it's a convention or something, that means that you don't believe in truth or something. And then you find yourself getting sucked into this rabbit hole where you don't know how you get this, a quicksand or something. And all of a sudden you're stuck in this like situation. You don't know how to get out of it anymore. But yeah, you just have to kind of take a deep breath, take a step back, just ask them politely, you made this claim, just explain to me the first premise. Explain to me what the premises are, first of all, but like, how do you defend this claim? There'll always be an implausible claim, and it's typically going to be relating the existence of God to the intelligibility of whatever, where they love this, preconditions of intelligibility, big, long, fancy sounding word, but they're basically just saying, unless God existed, this thing that you think is obvious would be impossible, right? And that's you can have more or less plausible versions of that claim. I don't want to get necessarily too often to the weeds of the philosophy, but you did mention in that article earlier, it was Van Til versus Stroud. So the Stroud in that is Barry Stroud, who is a philosopher who was writing stuff in the 60s about transcendental arguments as they occurred in analytic philosophy. So it's not a religious context particularly, but he has this great analysis of that. It seems to me completely killed the discussion after that. Transcendental arguments went right out of fashion after Stroud stomped all over them with this series of papers that he had. And in that, he explains the distinction between the kind of modest and ambitious transcendental argument. And your modest transcendental argument will say something like, unless you believe X, then you some other token thing about your mental experience would be missing, like the intelligibility of your conscious experience would be missing, something like that. And an ambitious transcendental argument wouldn't say, unless you believe X, it would be unless X is true, right? So it's a distinction between an epistemological claim and a metaphysical claim, right? Unless there's some belief in your head, X would be impossible. It's the modest argument, the ambitious argument, unless there was something out there in the world,
Right.
this thing would be impossible, right? So modest arguments, sometimes they're plausible. So for instance, you might think, unless you believed that you were, God's gift to women when you went to a bar to try and hook up, maybe you'd be less successful at doing it, right? Maybe it's a good strategy to believe that, right? Maybe it's got some benefit. Or maybe unless you believed you were happier than you actually are, you'd be less inclined to get out of bed and do all the commitments that you've got to do and stuff like that. So maybe
it's almost like a pragmatic, applicable belief, even if it isn't true necessarily.
That's right. That's the whole point. Is it doesn't really matter if it's true. It's just the connection between having the belief and this other thing about your mental life kind of working properly. So often there are connections between those types of things, and it's not like it's completely implausible. It's just it doesn't tell you anything about what's true in the actual world, right? Apart from what's true about your mental life. The ambitious arguments are saying, unless, say, God existed, my experience would be completely a scrambled mess of noise or something, right? Now, that's much more interesting claim in a certain way, right? But it's obviously much more ambitious. But the problem with it, the thing that Stroud sort of nails really clearly, is that you're going to have a really hard time getting anywhere near proving a claim like that. It's just
to prove anything of it, right?
Yeah, right. Like, why should it be, just in principle, why should it be the case that unless some object external to me existed, some part of my mental life wouldn't be the way that it is? I mean, just pre-reflectively, you just might think to yourself, maybe there's nothing outside my mind, right? Maybe I'm just dreaming and I'm the only thing in existence and nothing exists. I mean, I'm not saying I think that's true, but in some sense, it's a kind of background possibility at the edge of my experience. It could be, right? Maybe that's what's going on. Very difficult to rule that out. But the point is, the difficulty of ruling that out is the same difficulty of establishing that something actually exists, and it must be there in order for you to have this mental experience. Like, it just kind of seems like I might just have mental experience, nothing else exists at all. And if that's a possibility, it's always blocking off this ambitious argument, because it needs to show that there is something out there, and if it didn't exist, then your mind wouldn't exist or something.
Just going back to the funner analogy about going to the bar, you have the modest one of saying, look, if in a pragmatic way, if I believe this, I am God's gift to women at the bar, and therefore it builds my confidence. I go, and next thing you know, I'm able to achieve my goal of picking up a beautiful girl. That's more of a modest stance. But would it be fair to say the aggressive one is saying, no, I am actually I am God's gift to women, and this is like a certainty, kind of getting back into that certainty that precepts like. You're saying that's a stronger case, and how do you prove that? What do you say? Oh, well, I actually took a girl home, and that's evidence that.
Right.
How do you actually assert that that's the case? Because that's assuming the first premise, like you said from the very beginning, I'm God's gift to women. How do you know that? How can you even assert or make that claim even true? So going back to logic or rationale or mathematics or language or whatever type of avenue they want to go down, without God, you can't have these things. It can't make sense.
Right. So let's think about it in terms of like logic and God, right? So it might be plausible. I don't think this is true, but it might be somewhat plausible to you to think, unless I believed that God existed, then my experience of logic would be different, right? It wouldn't make any sense in some way or another, right? You might just think, unless there was this kind of transcendental lawgiver and non-material being holding everything in place or whatever, then there couldn't be these, non-material regularities that the laws of logic are or something. And you might just think, I have to believe in the first thing in order for the second thing to be sensible on my view. And maybe, okay, cool. But the difference is like, that could be true, right? But it's still not the case that God exists. Because it might be necessary for me to believe that God exists for logic to make sense, and it's not true that God exists, right? Those things are not logically incompatible with each other. So this explains the difficulty of the ambitious argument, right? Because to actually say unless God actually existed, independently of what I believe, logic would be incoherent to me. That requires a completely different level of, I mean, I can't really imagine what you would have to say in order to establish that. And here's where the trick really comes in, is that skillful presuppositionalists, I don't know if they're thinking about it at this level, but they will flip-flop between the two, right? So they'll say, because the modest premise, very easy to establish, or at least relatively much easier to establish. And then certainly if you agree to that, and then they switch to an ambitious version of the argument, but you didn't notice or whatever, right? Because it's a much higher burden of proof that's required to justify the ambitious premise. So if you don't notice that they've done a switcheroo from one to the other, you can get sort of, well, maybe they don't know themselves. They don't know this distinction, and they're not really getting that you have to do more than motivate the modest premise to justify the ambitious one or something. But either way, there's this, you have to be careful to catch the difference between them. So it's often, I think it would be helpful to say things like, do you mean, unless I believe X, then blah, 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 or do you mean unless X is actually true, then blah, blah, blah.
Right. And most of the guys online take the latter, even if they, like you're saying, oh, it's snowing heavy outside. Even though, is it really snowing outside? Here's a philosophical discussion, right? I like what you said there. Maybe they unconsciously or subconsciously go into the harder and bounce back and forth, maybe not aware of it, but it sounds like the online guys are asserting the latter. They are pushing for the, yes, I am certain logic cannot exist without God first. Mathematics cannot exist without God. Language, rationality, nothing would be intelligible if there wasn't God. And that's an assumption, I would say, that we don't have, I would say. And this is the interesting idea. I guess I'd like to get your thoughts as an expert who's thought through this. And this is part of your worldview. I know this is exiting a little bit of the online stuff, but for the viewer online who's interested in hearing a philosopher who's heard these things, who's dealt with these arguments, how would you explain intelligibility? I know that's a long one, but if I can make you full screen, and I got to use the restroom real quick. My bathroom's right next to me, but this is my excuse to walk away for a second. But if you could explain, as someone who self-identifies as atheist, correct? I don't want to pigeonhole you.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so you don't believe there is a God. How do you explain intelligibility, giving you, this is on you, the onus is on you to kind of build something that allows the viewer to kind of see that, oh, wow, so it isn't God must exist, therefore there's intelligibility in the universe. Things make sense. I can add, I can calculate, I can observe, I can test. There seems to be some sense in this chaotic and uniform universe, a way in which things make sense to me, therefore not God necessarily. How do you make sense of it? And I'll be right back.
Okay. So the question is about how I explain intelligibility, but this is a subjective notion, right? It's about like, well, it's about how my ideas are interrelated with one another, so that the world of experience is not a kind of booming, buzzing confusion, just a big mess of one thing after another without any coherence to it. So in a sense, what we're talking about is a kind of psychological notion. Why is it that my experiences like hang together and don't just aren't just a disentangled mess? And to some extent, that's got nothing to do with philosophy, because there's going to be an explanation of that in terms of how my brain works and how it like unifies my experiences. A lot of that's done unconsciously, and it's nothing to do with what I believe in. So, welcome back. I was just saying that the notion of intelligibility, a lot of it's done unconsciously, right, by my brain, without me really involving myself in that in any way.
If I may, can I press while we go to kind of get deeper into this? Because
absolutely.
It sometimes helps us to point things out. And I'm going to put words out there and tell me if these, maybe you go down this path. I started with the God thing my whole life. You didn't have the same upbringing as I did, but God is the answer to why the world makes sense, to why yada, yada, yada. When I started deconverting, in that process, I recognized evolution. I recognized we are animals on a planet that have grown, our brains have developed in a way that allow us to think on levels and rationalize in ways that our ancestors didn't necessarily do, including language and things like this. I look at it almost from an anthropological, scientific lens of saying these things evolved as part of evolution. We've come to make better sense and to help survive better in the world through language, all these things.
Mhm.
And so for me, I'm looking through a different lens from what does the actual evidence on the ground suggest? How can we draw these kind of conclusions? And so I'm looking at intelligibility, and the question I have as a non-philosopher, a non-epistemologist is, it is pretty ironic that we're looking at the world and we have calculations, we have language. It makes sense. I'm communicating with you. You understand what I'm saying, things like that.
Mhm.
But I no longer need to jump to, therefore, there needs to be a God in order to make sense of this. It's totally
Okay.
detached. That idea isn't even involved in my mind anymore because we are trying to make sense of a world in which we are born. Neil deGrasse Tyson famously said once, the universe is not meant to make sense necessarily for us. We are primates trying to survive. So oftentimes we have irrational concepts or irrational
Yeah.
things that help us to survive that aren't necessarily true. Um, and I'm kind of wondering if you are getting a gist of what I'm saying, but the world makes sense through that naturalist lens of us surviving and coming to these conclusions rather than asserting some metaphysical being.
Right. I see where you're
You know,
coming from. And I think one thing to bear in mind is that, like, I might have a position that's quite radically different from where you're coming from, and which may or may not be helpful as a way of answering the question. Because I guess, though you're not religious anymore, I do get the feeling that you still carry a baggage of religious way of thinking, and I
mhm.
know people who have the same type of thing. For instance, talked to Matt Dillahunty a bunch of times before. He used to be very religious as well, and sometimes I think, and I've said this to him as well, that I think there's still a kind of lingering religiosity in some of the ways he thinks about things. You know, it's like Nietzsche's whole point about God being dead is that, you know, we've given up on the kind of proposition that God exists, but we've still carry around the inheritance, the intellectual inheritance of all of the ideas of Christianity. We haven't really grown out of that yet. Now, I'm not saying you haven't grown out of Christianity at all. Obviously,
I'm
you
not
have done in
offended at
many
all. I
ways.
do think there's
But
definitely stuff there.
right,
Yeah.
right. But all I'm saying really is that, like, as I see it, the religious attitude, the fundamentalist attitude anyway, is that there are black and white answers to lots of these types of questions. And often the answers are very simplistic, like, why is there
Mhm.
intelligibility? Because of God, or whatever. It doesn't really tell you very much, but it does put the worrying thought to bed and allows you to carry on, whatever. So it's psychologically reassuring to have that black and white answer. And
Right.
also, you belong to a community of people who, I guess, individually will vary in different degrees, but, like, on paper all believe a certain list of things, you know, creed that characterizes your, you know, maybe you're Orthodox Christian or you're Reformed or you're a Catholic or whatever. What that means, broadly speaking, is a big list of things that sometimes they write them down, and it actually just is a list of propositions that they agree. Where this is, you know, the Declaration of the Westminster Confession of Faith or whatever. And, like,
Right. 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 I
that's
used to
a
hold
list of
to that.
propositions that, yeah, exactly. Um, but if you're not religious, you don't have any of that stuff. You don't have a list of propositions that we all believe, and there's a big club of people where you're defined by some attitudes that you all share in common.
Mhm.
Um, and I think that that's quite a drastic change. It's not like when you're religious, you all think, you know, you have, or one might have, a set of propositions that they believe in, a community around them who all verbalize that they all believe in those things too. A very kind of, you know, heterogeneous kind of way of looking at things. Heterogeneous, homogenous, I guess is the word I
Yeah.
mean.
Yeah.
Everyone thinking the same thing. And that then when you deconvert, you just join the other gang and they all think the same thing, but now you are part of them too. And I think some people think that's what deconversion is. It's just converting to the religion of atheism or something.
Yeah, I hear that a lot.
But for me, I've never been a religious person in any sense whatsoever. Even as a small child, I think I was an atheist, right? So I've never had a big gang of people who intellectually believe the same thing as me. And that means that I can, I think, sometimes have a common ground with Christians on certain issues and disagreements with atheists on certain issues, and don't really fall very neatly into one of those camps or the other. So in a sense, I just don't really feel any pressure to say what my worldview is about whatever, how I explain this, that, or the other. I don't feel the need to have a big explanation, big coherent worldview, or really even I don't really know what a worldview even is supposed to be, right? I mean, so let me just say a few things about this. So like, part of the script for presuppositionalists is often like, how do you account for this on your worldview? Well, this is a typical way of this kind of jargon or whatever that comes up. And it is presupposing a bunch of what I was just describing there, which is that like, well, what does your gang of people, what does your tribe of people intellectually say about this thing? That's what it's saying. But if you are a loner, intellectually speaking, and don't belong to a tribe, it doesn't really make any sense, right? I don't have a creed. I don't have like a priest who I go and see every week who tells me what we believe about this type of thing. I get it. I'm just on my own, thinking it through for myself. So,
well,
what are you asking me?
I don't want to derail you. I don't want to derail you, but I have some things that are in the vein of this that.
Okay, no. Feel free to derail me at any time.
Okay, so then let's derail for 1 second in the vein of this, because I definitely see humans naturally, I would say for the most part, gravitate tribalistically to common ideas we share, and we group that way. And this is totally normal. We see that in nature, and that's why I think we do that. It's also comforting to have kind of an echo chamber or even a support from an audience that also thinks like you. So there's psychological reasons, and there is pragmatic reward in that kind of thing versus trying to go upstream in every avenue, in every arena. I'm only going to go to the groups that disagree with me, versus that. So I imagine we naturally groove into common ground. I get that. And I agree. I think there's absolutely that. And there's nothing I think I can work on it, but I imagine subconsciously we're naturally going to do this. So I kind of want to move beyond that and just simply say, I agree with you. Ultimately, I would say the answer is, why is there intelligibility? I don't know. Like, I don't ultimately know. I'm not going to pretend I have that key. And I'm making guesses. I'm making the best observable guesses I can based on what the research I'm trying to do. And I'm not doing it in this religious sense. There is the sense, though, you want the answer, right? So in religion, they want to give you the answer. And that, I would say, is the carryover of religion to me. And I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. I admit it's there. For example, did Jesus really rise from the dead? You might say, I'm not convinced, and give philosophical reasonings and things like that and go down in arguments. I would actually argue there are several more plausible explanations for why it didn't happen. He didn't actually rise. From a literary standpoint, from a comparative standpoint, this is well-established literary, like all across the board. There are various forms of deities and heroes that also accomplish much of the same deeds. And of course, they'll throw to me, that doesn't disprove this one. And I go, well, you know what? You can't falsify the others. So they're all true. Heracles really did ascend to Mount Olympus, I guess. And Dionysus really did turn water into wine. The list can go on and on. Milk into wine. There are various different sources. My point is like, I'm not saying and you may never know that answer. Do you kind of rest on it's a brute fact that there just is, and this is our experience, and therefore we don't need to have that answer? How do you respond to that? Because I'm making the best guess by saying it seems to me we evolved. If we look at our ancestral fossil record and such, and we say we evolved, we weren't speaking English, 300,000 years ago or 1 million years ago in the canopy of the trees in Africa. Language evolves. At some point, we end up finding ways to somehow navigate survival on this earth. And that's my best guess. And I know that other people in the atheist trend naturally gravitate toward a scientific explanation to try and make sense. And so I don't know if that's wrong of me in your view, or if that's just like, hey, I get it. I get it. You're not necessarily doing this thing that is this religious move. I'm not trying to. I'm simply saying I can't ultimately explain why it all makes sense, why it is intelligible.
But what do you mean? What's the question we're actually talking about? What
Why do
intelligibility?
things
What do you
make
mean by that?
sense? Right? They're
Why
talking
does
about
what make sense?
huh?
Why does what make sense? Sorry.
Why are things intelligible? How come we can calculate? How come we can reason and you understand my language and we have this common ground? I'm speaking as though I'm reacting to the God is the reason question. So like
Right.
you see what I'm doing here.
I see what you mean. So I think that right. So I think that there's just some kind of lost in translation thing going on because I feel like the question that you're asking is too broad to really have any kind of meaningful answer. I mean, like, do I believe that we evolved over a long period? Of course, absolutely. They, you know, our ideas weren't fully formed, you know, throughout evolutionary history. They and they're not fully formed now. And yeah, absolutely, all of that just seems to me obvious. I mean, people are denying that they're on a different planet. They're not really engaging with evidence or whatever. So that stuff, it's not up for debate as far as I'm concerned. But is that really the answer to the philosophical question I think you were trying to ask? And I wonder because I'm not really sure what exactly it is. So like, I think that the terminology that you're using comes in the lineage of presuppositionalists because they're often talking about why are they talking about intelligibility? Where does that word come from? Why is that part of the script that we're going through? Well, it's because transcendental arguments through the lineage of Van Til go back to a bunch of work that was done by Immanuel Kant, who's an Enlightenment philosopher, German, or I guess Prussian philosopher from the, what we're talking about, the 18th century, right? And he is undergoing a very specific project about the, I guess, I don't want to talk too much about Kant because it's very, very complicated and
We can do an episode
I would be
in the future.
self-derailing if I did that. But he's performing a kind of rigorous a priori investigation into the conditions that give rise to conscious experience. That's one way to put it. And he very much is talking about intelligibility, the coherence of our manifold of experiences, right? And one of the super interesting and like cryptically difficult bits of his critique of pure reason, that's his magnum opus, his kind of like key enlightenment text, is one of the key ideas in there is about the unity of apperception, right? So he's broadly speaking, right, this is no way to really summarize this and do justice to it at the same time, but this is something along the ideas of like, unless there was a kind of unified nature to your experience, then it would be completely unintelligible. Broadly, roughly, think about it like this. It's a bit like experience, he thinks, is something where you can't take out one bit of it and have that on its own, right? Like, think about it like this. Imagine, obviously your experiences is like a sequence of things that happens one after the other. You know, you have your cup of tea, then you go for a walk, then you look down at your shoe, then it starts raining, blah, 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 whatever it is. One thing happens after another. Now, each of those things can make sense. You can think about what it was like when you looked down at your shoe or when it started raining or something, but they're implicitly in a context of like being before something, being after something else. They're like, you know, think about how the like emotional state that you're in or just the kind of general experiences impinge upon that one experience. And like, you know, there's other philosophers, Edmund Husserl in the beginning of the 20th century makes a big deal out of this type of stuff too, and phenomenology. But like the idea Kant's trying to say is that you couldn't really, it doesn't really make any sense to think about experience being simply just one snapshot on its own, like a single frame from a film or something. That kind of does make sense because you can hold it up and look at it and see this is just a still frame of like the wagon wheel going round or something. But like Kant thinks that your conscious experience couldn't be broken down like that. It has to be kind of all as one. This is kind of like
almost like a narrative in a way.
A narrative, yeah, absolutely, yeah, that's it, exactly. A stream of things, not just individual atoms of experience. So you can see that, just broadly speaking, without going into any more of the detail, how what he's talking about is like the preconditions of the intelligibility of your experience. And he's making a claim, and there's very difficult, very cryptic and complicated arguments, that the big system thing that you have to go through to work out why he's saying what he's saying and how it makes sense, right? And that is the lineage into which we get transcendental arguments, because he has, the term transcendental comes from Kant, basically. He has a transcendental deductions of the categories and whatever, blah, blah, blah. You can find out, like, you should get a Kant scholar on and talk to them one day about this.
Right. I get it. And I'm not trying to have you speak and then misspeak on something that he...
Oh, yeah, no, don't worry about that. I will certainly misspeak, but I will give a decent thumbnail sketch of what we're talking about without being very accurate or academically too accurate on Kant. I'm not a Kant scholar, but my point really is just to say that the term intelligibility and intelligibility of experience, the preconditions of intelligibility, all of that stuff is coming out of this Kantian idea. But I don't think you're asking me about that. That's not actually what you mean when you say, how do you account for the intelligibility of whatever it is, right? You don't really mean that. You were saying something much more broad. But I think let's park all of that, because I think there's just distraction by people in this tradition who don't really know the philosophy very much and don't really realize that what they're doing is misusing terms from the Kantian tradition and they know nothing about. Let's think about something like, look, what if somebody said, how do you account for the laws of logic as an atheist? Like, is this a typical argument? And if you say something like, well, I mean, I guess they don't exist really, like physical things, they might say, aha, but aren't you committed to this ontology that there are only material things, right? You, as an atheist, don't believe in things like gods or angels or souls or whatever. So how come there can be laws of logic on your worldview, right? Aren't you just committed to things that science can measure? Science can't measure laws of logic. They're not in a test tube or whatever, right? So you might think, oh yeah, I have to explain the laws of logic in terms of something ultimately material. And that might be very challenging, right? If you take yourself to have such a restricted ontology, right, picture of like what exists, that only material things exist, then yeah, there are things like what laws of logic are, what mathematical objects are, but other things too, like what's a possibility, what's a property as opposed to a thing that has a property. What do you mean? Like redness, is that just all of the red things, or is there something independently that's redness that exists beyond the things themselves that instantiate that property? There's a whole world of like things you have to figure out. What do I think about? What's a moral value?
You can see why I call this mental masturbation, right?
Well, I can see why the way that it's used by presuppositionalists in an aggressive, macho manner is. But these are just philosophical questions that I don't think are worthless. I think that they, the value of philosophy is something that philosophers talk about, right? And there are philosophers who think that philosophy is worthless. Okay, so it's not like I am committed to 100% to these being meaningful questions.
Right.
I don't think that they're definitely just word games. Philosophy in general is just a big word game, right? I don't think that that's true.
I'm just saying some of the. I might like give an example, redness, and let's suppose 5 philosophers come up with 5 alternative hypotheses of redness, and they have a variation and they're completely contrary to each other, or maybe they're not exclusive and they're just so out there and stuff, and there's no way to ever falsify or even prove these points. To me, it feels like mental masturbation on things. For example, I'm asking you philosophical questions because I'm not a philosopher. We're hanging out. We got 334 people live. I don't go on my day-to-day basis going, how come I understood what the back of that box said when it had language describing ingredients for this, and I knew to calculate how much to pay for my rent on. I don't think like, I need to explain and rationalize and have an answer for that and why that is, in order for my life to make any sense and to go about my day. I don't. It's when you do encounter these people. But when we're talking, like, I call it mental masturbation because in my mind, when I do talk to very sophisticated guys like you on philosophy, and they'll go, well, math, there's 3 main ways in which math can be made sense. And let's go over those 3 main ways. And then I go, okay, so what's the answer? And you go, well, we don't know the answer to this. And I'm like, okay, so then Let's
Yeah.
suppose I perform my brain muscles over the next 10 years. I become philosophically astute and I am well acquainted with the greatest minds from Hume to the theistic side. And next thing you know, I go, well, what's the answer? And like, we don't know. There's argumentation. You can
Yeah.
maybe find ways to
But
falsify
look,
some of
think
these.
about it like this. I mean, if there were answers to those questions that everybody could agree upon, then they would just have become part of science, right?
Right.
What are lightning bolts, right? There was a period in time where people didn't really know what that was, and the philosophers would speculate about what they were. It's cliche about like people thinking it was Zeus hurling thunderbolts down at people when he was annoyed with them or something. But people may have had all sorts of explanations for them. These days we have a scientific explanation that kind of moved out of the realm of speculative philosophy and became part of empirical science, right? So philosophy in a way is just where problems live when we don't know how to resolve them empirically. So it's not like a gotcha to say, oh, yeah, but you can't, like, there aren't any answers in philosophy. Yeah, that's why they're philosophy and not maths or physics or biology or sociology or whatever. If they did have answers, or if we at least knew enough about the question, parameters of the problem, to be able to kind of cleanly define what the problem was, it wouldn't be philosophy anymore. It would have just, that's how sciences become sciences. Everything starts off as speculation of philosophers, and it's only after time that some of those things get like promoted or demoted, however you want to think about it, into the empirical realm. So philosophy is just the ideas factory before, like where, these nebulas where stars are just big bunches of gas before they turn into discrete objects of things, right? That's what philosophy is, like the gaseous kind of nebula realm where ideas are, it's not clear where they begin and where they end, or who's right or who's wrong, what's going on. Right. That can be super exciting if you like that stuff. If you don't like uncertainty and vagueness, it can be super frightening. If you're a scientist or if you're a religious person, it can be difficult to find your way around that type of thing. So
thank you for making that point. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and that is, as a non-philosopher, I mean, I'm not this. I find Christian apologists in various forms, evidentialists, presup, you name it, often love that avenue of philosophy. They love to be in that avenue, and when they encounter a channel like mine that mainly deals with historical, mundane, evidentialist, literary, etc., they tend to, they act like I have no clue what I'm talking about or any of this. And I'm dealing with, leading experts in the world from a critical standpoint. Even some are theist Christians who just don't have this inerrancy view of the Bible, who have a much more critical, there are flaws, there are problems, it's legendary, it's this, it's that. And they see it, and we have a common experience in recognizing what it looks like. And this is going to sound like I'm really derailing, going back even further philosophically.
Okay. I don't mind.
I want to make a comment and then have you take us into this, because we go back to the great pre-Socratics, to the great minds in antiquity in the Greek world. These are non-Christian, non-Jewish Greeks. And I find it's an ironic thing for me to say this when I was in chat with Jay Dyer. Like, do you not find it a little bit strange that God reveals these truths, not to the Jews, not to the Christians, but to the Greek pagan philosophers, that are not your guys? And of course, later church fathers actually rationalize this. When you read their letters, they rationalize and say, well, God revealed these things to them. So in a sense, they were actually Christian. They would make arguments for Plato and all this stuff. Anachronistically, he really had been revealed the revelation of Christ. And look how morally astute they were. I mean, these guys were really moral people. And I'm going, you don't find that the heritage from the Greeks handing it down the baton to Jewish and Christians, that doesn't do anything mentally to make you go, why didn't you just give it all to Moses or give it all to these guys and like find a way? And they tried to rationalize that. Many of the Jewish philosophical minds, Philo of Alexandria and such, tried to go, well, further back, Moses did initially get this stuff. But every scholar in the field who knows how Hellenized these Jewish thinkers were by the Greek philosophers and the Greek thought of the day, and the Roman at times, recognize that the impact was not from the Judeo background as much as it was from that Greek sophisticated background that made them paint Moses in the picture of Greek thought. And so
Okay.
I'm giving you evidentialist like argumentation from the literary point. I get it, but I did a video called "Meet the God of the Real Bible," and I show how ancient Near Eastern scholars compare Yahweh and El, depending on if you see them as two deities, which is what these scholars say. They get morphed and fused into a single one over time when monotheism's on the scene. This God was anthropomorphic. I'm not just talking about language-wise. This God had an actual body, legs, hands, eyes, according to the ancient scribes and the ancient worshipers of this deity that went into the temples and such. He had an actual penis. He had children. He had a wife. And I document all of this and show what the experts say. Eventually, thanks to Plato and the great minds of philosophy, God becomes this immaterial, outside, unfalsifiable being that, and it just, to me, I'm like, thanks, Plato. I appreciate it, guys. Now we're dealing with a different God. Do you have any thoughts, philosopher, on anything that I said?
Well, I mean, there's a well-known distinction between the God of, Christianity, God of Abrahamic religions, and the God of the philosophers, right? That's classic, right? The God of philosophers. Typically, we're talking about. Depends exactly where I mean, Aristotle obviously has this idea of the kind of unmoved mover or whatever, the pure actualizer, blah blah blah, and that directly feeds into Christian philosophical apologetics. Your Aquinas and your Anselms and stuff like that. These guys in the early, when's Anselm, like 1000s, something like that. But in this period, what's going on is Greek literature is being rediscovered through interactions with the early Islamic, what am I trying to say, civilization, empire, whatever. Right?
Yeah, there was a great, almost enlightening phase for a century or two in Islamic thought based on the Greek text.
That's right, because what happened is that the Western Roman Empire collapsed and it was kept alive in the East. And then the Eastern Roman Empire, large parts of what they controlled were taken over by the Arabs, who inherited a bunch of Greek texts. So over in Britain and France and Germany and stuff, we were licking slime off the back of rocks at this point, whilst the Arabic world were doing, algebra and physics and rational, and doing the Kalam, cosmological argument and stuff. We were absolutely nowhere, but we inherited that, and Christian intellectual thought inherited that too. And so, yeah, there's a whole lot of Greek philosophy that's infused right at the base, hundreds of years ago, 1,000 years ago, into Christian intellectual life, and it's we're still seeing it right now, absolutely. But yeah, there's a big conflict there. It seems to me it's not really ever resolved very well, because on the one hand, you've got this idea of a personal God who cares about what you do, who you sleep with, what you believe, how you act, stuff like that, has a personal relationship with you, has a son who dies and cares about what happens, blah, blah, blah. All these human interests. They might be of a really super duper human or whatever, but they are human interests nonetheless. And then the God of the philosophers is kind of this timeless, spaceless, entity that's ultimately responsible for why everything exists, but it's impossible to think of him having human-like projects, right? Or activities, or really knowing you in any particular way, because it's kind of an unchanging entity. You can't get to know you, or anything like that. So the two notions are kind of, broadly speaking, I would say incompatible, but very difficult to reconcile. I mean, there's a big tension there. That's a well-known problem, right? Sorry.
Do you think that, as you described philosophy, I think it's a great place for people who want to exercise their thoughts and test limits and boundaries. And I imagine we will discover many things due to this thinking process by intelligent people. Do you think that as science, which is based on the empirical, observable, testable, repeatable ideas that we find in the world, coupled with philosophy, I know that this has changed over time, and I've read some books where they talk about how science has kind of changed the way some philosophy has worked and how people have made observations about the world. Do you think that most philosophers, academic philosophers, are atheists because they are coupling that with science and seeing what fits reality as they see it? Why? I guess another way to phrase the question is, the last time I look at the statistics of PhDs in the field or in actual academics who are philosophers, the majority of them are not theists. Why do you think that is so?
Well, in a way, I'm kind of reluctant to engage in this type of thing because it's
Okay.
very, very speculative, and I'm not sure that this kind of sounds to me like a sociological question, and
Mhm.
I'm not anywhere near well versed enough in it. But
Got it.
I mean, a competing thing that I can't tell you how to distinguish between is probably what's true is that most academic philosophers are middle class, right? In order to go to university, you have to be somewhat rich. In order to pick a subject like philosophy that's got no vocational prospects attached to it, you have to be even more secure in your own welfare or whatever. If you're
Right.
worried about living day to day, if you are lucky enough to go to university, you'll probably do something vocational, law, medicine, something like that, to secure your future and to look after your family or whatever. If you're the kind of idle, aristocratic layabout like me, I guess, or most people who get that. I mean, I just wonder whether this is a selection effect that accounts for why
It's
people
a
have
good
those
point.
views. Right? I don't know that there's anything profound about that. It could just be a correlation between some material condition and people having certain types of jobs. So I don't know that there's anything specifically profound
Right. There are
about
other
that.
factors to play in that answer potentially that you're not aware of that are going on, and that may
Yeah.
you don't feel comfortable even giving an answer that you're not sure why ultimately. I respect
Because
that.
I can't filter that out. So I certainly don't want to say anything like, "Oh, look, if you start engaging with philosophy, and suddenly you realize all religions are a joke or something." That's wildly ambitious, it seems to me, because
Mhm.
certainly you can't just look at a survey of philosophers and draw that type of conclusion out of it. There's
Right.
many things that could account for that. So yeah, that's not the type of thing and I also, to me, this sounds like the type of thing where people say, you hear these like white nationalists or whatever who say, European civilization, we invented the steam engine and like blah blah blah, and we must protect it. This is all bullshit, right? This is all just pseudo historical rationalizing to fit your own prejudices or something.
Right.
Right?
Right.
That's a particularly egregious example of that, but it's also somewhat. I get my spidey senses tingling whenever somebody says something like, "Oh, but the Phil Studies survey or whatever it is." Where it's like, taking the views of philosophers, most of them are atheists, or most of them blah, blah, blah. I think the same thing that I do. Therefore, that must mean that my views are good.
Right.
That's not how philosophy works. For one thing, you can't just take a poll and say that most people think this, therefore, whatever. The reality of philosophy, as probably true in history too, and probably true in every intellectual discipline, is that like the more specialized you get, the less in keeping you are become with whatever the majority view is, because you've
Right.
spent 10 years deep diving into something. You probably have picked up a specific point of view as a result of that, and it would
Right.
be weird if everybody else already thought that who hadn't done a big deep dive into it. So
Right.
you just find, if you do any activity like this for a long time, you have to just be comfortable taking your own view, and it doesn't matter if somebody else thinks differently, or if the majority of whatever think differently about stuff. People will say the majority of scientists believe in the Big Bang or something. Okay, the majority of scientists are not astrophysicists, so it doesn't really matter what they think. Most of them are like podiatrists or whatever. Like they're cool that they think the Big Bang is true, but it's got really nothing to do with what they specialize in. So, and if you actually look at cosmogonists, the astrophysicists who look at the beginning of the universe, then the field's completely wide open, right? No, there isn't really any consensus on anything. So it doesn't help at all. It's actually misleading to say most scientists believe in the Big Bang, because most of them are completely unqualified to give a view about that. So it's the same with philosophy. Like even if they say they're atheists, if they never do any work in the philosophy of religion or in the question of atheism, it doesn't really matter. Right, you may as well ask if the majority of bakers are atheists, right? What's it got to do with it? Right, it's just a group of people.
I just figured it might have something to do with the fact that they're thinking through all of this because they're thinkers, and they might have seen enough to realize, whoa, why would we assume that? I guess that was what my mind is as a non-philosopher, and I've heard that before. That's why I repeated that argument or that question to you, as I've heard that said.
Yeah. Okay. So philosophers are correlated with people who question things, right? That's definitely true. And if there's a dominant religion in society, it's probably going to be quite likely, if there's a dominant viewpoint, whether political, religious, whatever, you're probably going to find philosophers, because philosophy is questioning stuff, right? If you're not into doing that, you're probably not into philosophy. If you are into doing that, you're probably not into just accepting wholesale what society tells you. So probably just with nothing else to go on but that, you could predict that philosophers would have countercultural beliefs. And lo and behold, they do. Right? So it doesn't mean that they're getting closer to the truth. It doesn't mean religion is bullshit. It doesn't mean, maybe most philosophers are like jazz music, right? It doesn't mean that like rock music is rubbish because of that, because they've thought it through in any way. So anyway, that's my view, right? I just don't really care about like philosophy surveys or what people think about stuff. I care about like philosophical arguments and how plausible they seem to me, whether they make me think that my views are inconsistent or I didn't realize that something followed from a given thing. That's interesting, but it doesn't really matter. I'll listen if someone I respect comes to me and tries to tell me something or whatever, but I'm not just going to be like, oh, Graham Oppy said it, so it must be true. Or William Lane Craig said it, so it must be false. That's like not the right way to think about it. And similarly, I wouldn't really care if everyone in philosophy of religion became theist. I mean, these things come in patterns and trends as well, right? Like a little while back, philosophy of religion wasn't fashionable at all. Hardly anybody worked in it. There's been a big resurgence in it over the last sort of 40 years or so. There's way more theists getting involved. I'm perfectly cool with that. No problem at all. Have theist voices in the community. That's absolutely great. It shouldn't be dominated by one viewpoint or another. But it's just an ebb and a flow of a tide, and then someday it will go out of fashion again. But it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean like religion is false because it's out of fashion, or that it's true because it's in fashion. You have to just sort of rise above that.
I just want to say to our audience, for those viewing, this is a true philosopher here we're talking with here. That's exactly the kind of answer you would expect from someone who's thinking the way a philosopher thinks. And it makes me think of Socrates and such. You're the one, I'm blaming you for the title of this video, because I chose the one over the other one, but you're like presuppositional and destroyed like you've never seen. Well, I watched the video that you sent me that's actually titled that, and the guy that was confident and certain about revelation to him. I don't know, you've engaged with some of the Orthodox Christian precepts like Jay Dyer and such. They will laugh at precepts that are Protestant, that are reliant, it seems, on scripture. It seems like it bases itself on scripture. But, and correct me if I'm wrong, maybe you know this and maybe you don't, I think when they base theirs on the church, if they're dealing with or a combination of both scripture and the revelation given to the church.
Yeah, I don't actually know that much about Orthodox. I mean, I guess they depart from Catholicism in like 5th century or something. It's pretty early, right? And it's some weird schism over Jesus' nature. I actually don't know. But then I guess they have their own tradition. Is it just the same as Catholicism? They have their own church fathers and tradition that's handed down to them, rather than, the Protestants it came about because of the translations of text. So suddenly they rediscovered reading the text in the vernacular, and that meant that they felt they suddenly had a viewpoint on the religious tradition that was different from what they were getting told by their priests and stuff. And that sort of fetishizes this idea of the book and direct connection to the Word of God or whatever. And I don't know if that's the same. I guess it's not the same in Greek Orthodox, but really, I'm not an expert in.
Got it. No, I just didn't know if you had.
My view is that presuppositionism really has nothing to do with, or very little to do with, the details of how the different bits of Christianity are different to each other. I mean, okay, sure, yeah, you might get someone like Branson or whatever will say, that this is grounded in the text because he's a Calvinist, he's Protestant, so it's absolutely that type of thing. So he'll pull out like bits of a bit of St. Paul, is it, where he's saying about how the unbeliever is like deceiving themselves, or God, I can't remember this stuff. You probably know what I'm talking about much better than I do, right? There's what's this phrase? Damn it! I used to know this
from the Bible.
Yeah, right. So Paul says something about how the unbeliever is like in a state of
They're dead in their trespasses and sins. They're completely dead. Like they don't have the knowledge of God in a way.
Right. But basically, without the detail, it doesn't really matter what the detail is, but they'll like point to some passage and say, in this bit of Corinthians, Paul says this, and that's how we know that, maths is true or something. And I think, okay, cool. Often those things are completely spurious, right? Like there was some precept guy, now I can't remember his name, but I think he's another one of these people who was taught by Van Til, who used to try and say that the laws of logic were like in the Bible, right? So when God says to Moses, I am that I am, right? This is apparently him grounding the law of identity, right? Because he's saying I'm identical to myself or something, right? And like that's kind of dumb in the most ridiculous sense, because obviously our point of the law of identity is that for any object, that thing is identical to itself. So like, it's great that God is telling you that he's identical to himself, if that's how you understand that passage. Obviously, there's loads of different ways of understanding what's going on.
Exactly. Yeah.
But suppose he was trying to say, for any x, x equals x, and that's what he was trying to communicate to Moses. It just seems ridiculous. But suppose he was saying that. Guess what? That's also true of this mug, right? It's also true that this mug is identical to itself, or, this table or my earlobe or whatever. Everything's identical to itself. So just simply being an instance of something that's identical to itself doesn't actually do anything to ground logic whatsoever. So it seems to me that the idea behind precept is just, like we were saying before, that there's this being that's grounding intelligibility, or metaphysics of logic or whatever. But it doesn't really matter. None of the detail about what that being is like and how it's related to some words in a book or what some church father said or whatever really make any difference to that claim. Like, it doesn't mean like, oh, if, some Greek Orthodox historical figure said such and such, then that's suddenly the key that unlocks the transcendental argument. Absolutely not. It has nothing to do with it. So it's just window dressing, it seems to me, when they relate the transcendental argument to their specific sect of Christianity. Right. I just try and gloss over those bits and get to the philosophy. Like, what's the reasoning? How does the inference work? What are you actually saying? Getting discussions of like what the different Bible verses are saying, basically, that's just a distraction technique. That's how I would view that. Just don't even engage in that.
That's an interesting point. It's like us talking about this and then observing a Calvinist and an Arminian argue about works-based salvation, or did you choose or did you not choose, like these pedantic mental games that we think, okay, did God initiate the Spirit first for you to react and then accept, therefore he monergistically saved you? I mean, like, all of this is theology lingo that I knew and I was in it, and it just sounds to me now like complete rubbish. And I don't mean that to be derogatory. I really mean I can do the mental games, I can get lost in the weeds and hear the arguments and look at the passages. It sounds like mental games that are useless, especially if you're using them in a debate format to try and gotcha, because that's usually what it is. But if you're interested in, like, what did the text say? What does the Bible actually, what does this author really think about these things based on what I'm reading? Then that's cool. And that's where I'm at now. So, like, I don't try to make sense of it. I realize the Bible's loaded with various viewpoints from different people doctrinally. Even in the New Testament, you have some free will ideas and you have some predestinarian ideas. Well, where did that come from? If you just look further back in the Dead Sea Scroll, Qumran sect, their literature had the same debate and problems amongst themselves. Mm-hmm. And you had some who said God determined the days from the very beginning, yada, yada, yada. And others who were like, no. The angels that fell, or the fallen ones, the watchers and such you see in Enoch, they freely chose to go and sleep with the daughters of men, etc. So there's so many different perspectives.
Right. Yeah, that's like resonating with what I was saying about when you interact for a long period of time on a field, say it's philosophy or if it's history, you end up having necessarily having a more nuanced view as a result, and you end up saying, well, before I just thought Jesus was this whatever it is, apocalyptic preacher, but now I know that there's like 17 different models of what Jesus, who Jesus was, and I now have a kind of sophisticated kind of probability weighting amongst those different hypotheses based on like their explanatory power as I view it, and blah blah blah. And you don't just have a black and white view; you have loads of different variations of like shades of grey all over the place. And this is how it is in philosophy as well. Like you said, I just want to know what the answer is. Well, the more you look at it, the more you're going to find that there's just shades of grey. And when it even seemed like to you to begin with, this seemed completely obvious. I mean, this is a typical thing that happens when an undergraduate studies philosophy. To begin with, you read a bit of like Descartes or something, and you think, like, Descartes is completely right about everything. And you read a bit of Hume, and you go, oh, no, Descartes was wrong about everything. Hume was completely right about everything. And then you read Kant, go, damn it, Hume was wrong, Kant was right. And then, it just goes on like that. And what's happening is you're like undermining your sense of like certainty and like confidence about everything. Now, welcome to philosophy. You've arrived when you don't have confidence about that. So, but it's similar with the history, right? I mean, you might think, oh yeah, it must be the case that whatever historical figure was like this. I mean, actually, when you look at it, no, there's lots of variations, and there's like scholars discuss some different points, and like if you want, you'll find a scholar that argues almost anything that you any opinion on almost any topic. You'll find somebody out there who's written a book about it, done a YouTube video about it, whatever, So.
Yeah. Just one more point, and then I got some super chats we can get as we exit, because I know it's getting late where you're at. And thank you for your time. This has been fantastic. We can do this again and dive into various topics. I love learning from you, and I love how you're not axe grinding either direction. You have your thoughts, and you're helping me to think through these things as well. What I was going to mention specifically, dealing with what was I going to mention? I literally lost it as I was trying to pivot from that. This is my point. I do think, I mean, we can get lost in like not knowing anything and pretending like we have no clue about anything. But one of the arguments that I'll bring up, and I do this often, is comparative, using a heuristic approach, comparative mythology, comparative literature, things like that. So I want you as a philosopher to gauge what I'm saying and see if this is if I'm making a strong case in your view. I'm sure there's holes. I'm sure there's ways we can lower my confidence. But when I look at, let's just say, a deity or a hero in Greek and Roman or Jewish mythology, and these are texts that may not even be canonical, but the hero, the god, whatever, does something, whether they are killed in a drastic way, similar to you see Jesus, and they are alive now in this celestial place where they ascended into heaven, whether it's Mount Olympus or whatever the place you may want to call. And you find there's method to this. So you're finding geographically, linguistically, you're finding a common cultural shared theme where even ancient authors themselves ascribed this kind of genre. They gave it a genre, calling it fable, calling it legend, or calling it myth. And we look back and say, here are these authors that are saying, these more elite educated authors that are saying, hey, there are people in the common world who probably believe some of these things, but I'm letting you know, in literature, which are the educated people who wrote and read and such, this is called a translation fable or a fable, or this is called a legend or a myth, and they categorize it. And then you find these weird stories in the New Testament that walk like a duck, talk like a duck, smell like a duck, taste like a duck, and everything. They look very much like the typical, what these other people ascribe genre-wise to Heracles, Dionysus, to heroes, to kings, to Caesars. The list goes on. And these are contemporaneous figures and deities that are extremely popular in the world which Christianity was born out of. And then I say to you, this is a strong case, in my view, to show that Jesus also fits that genre and therefore is in the line of legend making, myth, translation, fable, etc. Now, as a philosopher who's very critical, who's looking at me going, all right, you might have a bias. You might say, I already agree with you on this stuff anyway, based on my little research. But is this a strong case to you on showing why we could look with high confidence that Jesus is in the same vein as the rest of the before, during, and after legends and myths and fables?
I mean, in a way, it's a bit unfair because I'm not anywhere near as well versed in this area as you are. So asking my opinion about it is I don't pretend to have any particular insight on this. But I suppose off the top of my head, I do wonder whether there's a tendency for like pattern recognition across diverse cases. I mean, like obviously humans, it's cliche anthropological point that humans are like pattern-seeking creatures or whatever. But
Right.
you know, I don't know if you ever I watched this series of documentaries about the JFK assassinations called the Men Who Killed Kennedy. Right, the
I
men who
don't
killed
think I
Kennedy,
have.
because the whole point of it is that there's like loads of different theories. So
Right.
it's quite cool. It's old school. Anyway, the grassy knoll theory. You know, the guy who was in the like sewers underneath Oswald, whatever. There's loads of different ranges of things there. But what was kind of fascinating about it was that it's sort of like each episode focuses on a different theory, and it interviews people who are like advocates of that theory. And you know, some of them are very convinced about what's going on. You know, they picture taken, you know, of the cavalcade or whatever it is going past, and Kennedy's just been shot, and you can see the grassy knoll in the background. It's like the only still shot that's like supposedly got it in frame, but such low res, you have to zoom in on such a small bit. When you get into that and like apply the right like color adding techniques, and maybe they're dodgy, maybe they're not, whatever. Maybe if you look at it the right way, it kind of looks like a guy holding a gun, right? And if you spend absolutely ages going into all of the nuance, exactly how the resolution should be done, and blah, 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 I guess you could probably interview someone who gives you a really good case for that. And I don't know whether that's complete nonsense or if they're an absolute genius and maybe they've got it right or something. You just kind of have to accept that maybe there are convincing instances of patterns that you can spot amongst large pools of data, like ancient literature or astrological phenomena or resolution of photographs or whatever. But if you really, you know, if lots of people spend lots of time looking at it, they'll find different things. They'll put patterns in Bach's preludes and stuff like this. You know, the people have historically argued for stuff like that. Now, the difficulty as a layperson, like me looking into, you know, over your shoulder at this area that I haven't spent any time looking at, is I'm very unclear about whether what you're saying is well supported, or if it's an instance like this where there's people finding the patterns that over time they're reasserting in their brain, and they just start seeing a pattern, like this guy who thought the figure in this grainy photo looked just like a policeman holding a rifle, whereas I looked at it and it looks like a blob to me. But maybe if I spend ages looking at it, it'll look like that one too.
I would have to, I guess another way to put it is I would have to give you much more if you were even interested, which is another question. You may not even be interested in this question. And it's interesting to me because I thought Jesus was God in the flesh, the only way, the only truth, etc. So you could see why I had motivated reasoning when I started seeing similarities that were there based on other academics' works, that I want to understand, why did they come to this conclusion? And is this really true? And I guess I would imagine I came in and I gave you more and showed, hey, in the literary practices of the day in Greek, you had to know these stories. And I was able to show you that like they were not ignorant of this kind of material. And then Jesus just so happens to look very much like some of the material. Another way of putting it, I guess, instead of the grassy knoll JFK thing would be, I start to paint a picture of a guy dressed in black. He wears a cape. He has devices that make him fly. He usually comes out at night. He has an affinity to bats. I'm not talking about Batman though. Okay. Like at what point do you finally go, okay, something's going on? So there's so many factors. I appreciate your answer of not being sure. I knew you'd probably give me something like that, but imagine if I kept building that case and showing you more reasons, then I think the confidence level would build a little more in recognizing something's going on.
But it probably would if I kept on going on about how the moon landing is fake and kept showing you pictures. How do the flags waving if there's no atmosphere on the moon? What about this? Like if you speed the footage up, it looks like they're just in a normal studio. Blah blah blah. If I keep banging it on at you all the time and you get obsessed with it, yeah, maybe your mind will change. I don't know, but it's a psychological question as much as anything. I mean, is this approach good? In general, the approach should be to expose yourself to us if you really want to find out more about a subject. And look, this I'm no speciality in this. I'm broadly explaining the empirical method in general sense to you, which you already know about. But if you want to find out something about an empirical field, you should expose yourself to as much information as you possibly can about that, all the different diverse views, as much first-hand empirical evidence as you can, and then make your own mind up about it. So could you persuade me? That's an empirical psychological question. Maybe, I don't know. I mean, it depends on how persuasive you are as a speaker, blah, blah, blah. But none of that's relevant to whether it's true. It's just how susceptible would I be to that type of stuff? I mean,
I'm not speaking in a rhetorical way of convincing, even though that plays factors. Everything matters. Every little thing matters. I'm saying here's the literature. Here's what experts in the field say, and here's why they draw these conclusions. You can keep going back. Well, then why do they say this? Oh, and then why? And then read more literature. And then I'm just saying. I guess I figured I'd ask you, but that would be a rabbit trail we would never end a discussion on until you actually ventured into it.
I mean, there's a whole field of like the philosophy of history, right? So there are people who you could talk to who specialize in how to interpret and understand the empirical science of history from a philosophical point of view, right? There are philosophical questions in the study of history, just like there are philosophical questions in the study of biology or physics or mathematics or whatever. There's for any empirical subject, there's a philosophy of that subject, because at some point the broad, wide questions stop being clearly parameterizable and answerable, and they bleed into just this, as we were talking about before, like an idea factory of philosophy where no one really knows what's going on, right? So every subject has those kind of elements to it. So you'll find, if you want a good philosophical perspective, I'm not the right person. I mean, my philosophical expertise is really more in metaphysics or whatever. So if you ask me about the philosophy of history, I'm just not very good at that. It's not my field. So I can't say much more than I do. But I mean, I'm broadly sympathetic to the idea that they probably are just all myths and blah blah blah. But that's not because I have any kind of special insight to it. It's because it just seems right to me from the armchair. But who cares about what it seems like from the armchair? My armchair, what empirical science seems like, should have no relevance to anybody.
You're infallible in that armchair.
Okay.
Thank you, Gypsy Prince, for becoming a member of Myth Vision. I really appreciate that. Seth of Valhalla, thank you for the super chat. For a Christian, the content of Scripture must serve as his ultimate presupposition, true or false. I say false because there are several Christians, in fact, that don't hold to Scripture being that ultimate presupposition.
Catholics, like most Christians, probably don't think that's true, right? So that doesn't seem a very likely candidate for something that has to be true. That just sounds like the sort of thing that a Protestant precept would say, because they fetishize the notion of the Scripture being like the only possible thing that explains absolutely everything. So yeah, that does seem like a sort of weird cult-like extreme position to take, not one that every Christian takes. Absolutely, yeah.
Thank you. Vesper, please go into the history of sophistry in apologism. That would be another show, probably. I don't know.
Yeah, the history of sophistry. I mean, sophistry goes back before apologism. I've never even heard that the word apology being turned into an ism as such. But yes, sophistry. I mean, what sophistry means in their kind of historical pre-Socratic or at least ancient Greek context is like somebody who, a bit like the way that a lawyer will argue a case in court because they're paid to defend their client. Doesn't mean that they believe that the client is innocent or that the arguments that they're making are correct. What they're doing is making the argument for other reasons, right? Because they're paid to do so or whatever. Or if you pick, like, if you're in a debate club at high school, you will defend a proposition. It doesn't mean that you believe that it's true. It means that that's what you do in a debate club. You defend a proposition, and or you attack a proposition, whatever it is that you're doing. Or if you're trying to get laid in a bar, you might advance an argument. Maybe she's super into the Kalam, so you pull out all of those arguments or whatever. But you might be doing it for another purpose. That's my point. Is that like
right?
And a sophist is just somebody who would be advancing arguments for money, right? Whatever that's paid to do. It might be in a court of law. It might be in a debate. They'd be on YouTube these days, right? They'd be taking super chats, frankly, and arguing the point on either one of them. So sophist doesn't necessarily mean that they're wrong any more than like a lawyer is wrong or that they're deceitful or anything, but it does mean they're not doing argumentation in that kind of mindset of like, trying to discover the truth and being all like, I think some people have this idea that there's only one way to engage with argumentation and discussions and stuff, and it's that you have to have this attitude of like a truth seeker and someone who's trying to get to the truth or whatever. But the reality is people use arguments for all sorts of reasons. Many of them, perhaps most, perhaps all of them, are different from that, because you've got some agenda at play. You need to do something. You're trying to get laid. You want to get paid. You want to do whatever. Those are the agendas and things that are really like, and to try and pretend, well, when I'm engaging in an argument, all I'm doing is searching for the truth, and there's no ulterior motive, no agenda, no context, no nothing. I'm not a sophist. I'm a truth-seeking sage or whatever. That is probably just self-indulgent, sanctimonious, bullshit, basically. And, sorry, am I allowed to swear on this?
Yeah.
Okay. I don't want to get you demonetized or like whatever.
No, I get it. You'll be all right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
I don't imagine you going on a tirade of
I just think like a sophist often has this kind of connotation these days of being like sophistry just means like some kind of fallacious argumentation or something. But the history of it just is someone who's employing it professionally for whatever they're earning a living by making arguments. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that.
Thank you. James Apperson, thank you for the super chat. Presup equals gaslighting, distort reality to make malleable.
Okay, malleable doesn't have a U in it, I don't think. That's okay. Presup equals gaslighting. I mean, obviously, that's true in the sense of the type of wolf pack hunting stuff that we started off talking about, that the gang of guys who jumped on you and tried to make you feel intellectually inferior to them because they would say the big words that caught you off guard or whatever. There's a lot of things like gaslighting and stuff that go on there. As I said, it's linked to a kind of, I would say it's linked to a kind of toxic masculinity in a way. It's like trying to dominate other men or whatever, trying to be the big man. It's nothing, and there's something, I think it's something like kind of feminine, almost like cuck-like about like my attitude, which is, shrugging your shoulders and being like humble or whatever, trying to be open about like not knowing the answers to certain questions. I think that like some men will find that like unattractive because it's not masculine and big and strong. And I mean, I don't really care about that. It doesn't really matter to me, but I think that there's definitely a trend, a correlation between, bad, it seems to me like unhealthy pictures of masculinity and this type of approach to apologetics, very controlling and dominating and stuff like that. And
thank you for that.
Not me, anyway.
Yeah, no, appreciate it. I think I've experienced that as well over time. My certainty and confidence of knowing something. It's like I almost have a confidence. My confidence in now builds off of being open to not being right and being open to various ideas. So it's a maturity, I think, that's there. Grays 174, thank you so much. Is there any chance that you have read Richard Carrier's blog post in response to Presup about how logic works on physicalism?
I haven't. I do find Carrier's blogs quite difficult to get through. They're quite long and he's not my favorite philosopher. I quite enjoy listening to him talk about history, and I think he's a very, very articulate and entertaining person to listen to. I just have very different views on philosophy from him, so I don't tend to browse around his blog very much. And there's a lot of hot takes on Presup out there. So I'm not really familiar with his.
Thank you so much, Grays. Scott Duke in the house. What does Alex think of R.C. Sproul's critique of Van Til in Classical Apologetics 1984? What arguments did Van Til actually bring?
I seem to remember Sproul's critique was, or maybe I'm confusing this with Montgomery's, but I think Sproul basically said that Van Til didn't actually make the argument, and he was just like saying, well, what actually is the transcendental argument? And I must be forgetting some of the nuance here. I might even be getting the wrong person, but if that's right, that seems to be completely spot on anyway. And Van Til is, English isn't his first language. I think he was Dutch, a Dutch immigrant to the US. Obviously spoke English, but like didn't really engage in the analytic tradition that I'm in, and most contemporary English-speaking philosophers do, which is very, very influenced by logic. Frege, Russell, Wittgenstein, that type of thing, where logical form and stuff is sort of the most primary thing. Van Til really is engaging with like continental philosophy or idealism and Kantian tradition, that type of thing. So I think the criticism that he just never actually stated the argument in premise conclusion form is just true. I just think he never did that. It's some of his later people like Greg Branson or whatever sort of do, but then they end up giving premises that are completely implausible. Like, unless God existed, you wouldn't, logic wouldn't exist. And it's like, great, you've gone over the hurdle of stating an argument, but you haven't gone any further in defending it in any way that makes sense, that seems plausible. So I might be misremembering what Sproul's critique was, in which case I apologize, but that's what my brain is giving me at this point.
I just know he's reformed, and that takes you down a rabbit trail. I've read his works pertaining to post-millennial ideas in eschatology and stuff in the Bible. The Stacy's Mom podcast. Make sure you subscribe to these YouTubers, by the way. Many of them have YouTube channels, and they're actually, supporting the channel here. So go support them. After being blindsided and somewhat steamrolled by a precept in December, I really appreciate this conversation. No question, just a super thanks.
Nice.
Yeah. So did you ever get steamrolled? Did you ever get to experience that for your first time?
No, not really, because I never really talked to any precepts until I was well out of my PhD and that type of thing. And the first precept that I spoke to was this guy called Matt Slick. Do you know who he is?
Yes, I've heard of him.
And
I used to call into his show when I was a Christian back in the day. But.
Okay, that was my first time really on the internet, like on the YouTube, like as a person in a video, and it was really funny because it was like really late at night for me. I think I stayed up till like 3 a.m, and I was drinking whiskey as well. So it was like by the end I really needed to go to bed. But it was hilarious because I'd been doing this job before then. I was working in a brewery, which I thought was going to be really fun, and actually turned out to be just really tedious, like manual labor. And but anyway, it gave me a load of time to listen to podcasts as I was like lugging stuff from one side of this room to the other. And for some reason, I guess it was because it was just like street level philosophy fighting. His shows, people like phoning up and trying to be like, oh yeah, well I think logic is this, and then he would be like, yeah, well logic can't be that because blah blah blah. And it was, I just found it entertaining as a kind of like just something to have on in the background. And after a while, I was discussing some aspect of it with my wife. We went away with my family for Christmas, and I can remember in the car just being like, I think this guy I've been listening to, I think I'd like come up with this critique of his argument. I might phone into his show and like talk to him about it. And I did. And for some reason, he was unusually deferential that evening. I think it's because I said I had a PhD in philosophy or whatever, but fully entertained me and didn't talk over me and like let me explain. I think you can still see this on this YouTube channel. It's called the Bible Thumping Wingnut Show or something.
Oh, I've heard of it. Yeah.
Yeah, right. So if you search that for my name, you'll see this like 3-hour discussion where I explained why his argument was kind of question begging. And it's really funny because like I was setting it out in logical form, and I think that it was just this really like painful thing because he just couldn't understand what I meant by the logical form of the argument, and he spent like 20 years browbeating atheists because they don't understand logic. And I was like trying to say, it's like you're saying if P, then not P, then blah blah blah. I was like, and he was just not following it. So yeah, I guess that's probably it. Yeah, that's right.
Awesome.
So, because I think that's where I cut my teeth in the online internet world. I've always had a very easy ride with presuppositionalists because they didn't want to get into that situation again. So no, and now I think these days they back off getting in my face. So I think I've earned my stripes now.
There you go. Doc Pleuromanot, thoughts on Michael Boltler's review of Tag? It seems he is arguing, even if valid, all that is achieved are synthetic a priori truths without ontological necessities.
Exactly. Yeah, Michael Butler's actually really good. He's a presuppositionalist in this Manson Van Til school, and in some ways an awful person if you talk to him about political stuff. But a really, like, especially in terms of a presuppositionalist person, an advocate of presuppositionalism. He's very fair, and his I think actually his paper is really fantastic. And I wrote a blog post going through it a few years back, which I can send you so you can put in the description or something if you want.
Yeah.
So I can, if you read that, you'll see my like sustained engagement with that paper and exactly what my critique of it was. But broadly speaking, I think that he's right. It doesn't establish any ontological necessities, and he has this like really weak-assed way after basically saying that and saying this is really the strongest objection. And then it's basically Stroud's objection I was talking about before with the modest and the ambitious thing. He's basically saying you can't really establish the ambitious stuff, so all you've got is the modest, but that doesn't tell you anything about what exists in reality, right? It's just like, if I think I'm God's gift to women, then I'm better at picking them up in bars, doesn't mean I actually am God's gift to women, right? It was that point again. And he's saying that's actually the strongest objection to presup. And then he gives this really terrible thing at the end where he's like, but still we can say this. And it's like, no, you can't even say that. That doesn't work either. So that blog post would probably explain what I think about it anyway. But I do think Butler's very good. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Doc. Appreciate you showing up. William Ahrens, since having a crisis in faith early in life, I have found that as the concept of God becomes more distant and obscure, the more important the human relationships have become inside of the church.
Well, that sounds like something you could speak to more than I could.
Yeah, I can relate. In my sense, I guess what it took for me, because I had this really, really obsessed understanding of this controlling God that literally was watching over my every deed and knew everything that was going to happen before it happened, which makes me even more insane in my head thinking about it, because it's like, hold on, am I your child? You said that, I believed. I mean, as much as any human can describe what that means to actually follow, live, and believe and want this stuff to be true and stuff. And of course, some Christians will go, you never really were one of us. Well, God played a hell of a trick on me and honestly screwed me the hell over in my view, notice, because I'm sitting here trying everything I can. And then as I start exiting the Christianity over time, not becoming a non-theist, I was still a believer in some higher power. I was going to 12-step rooms and stuff to get clean from drugs and alcohol. God became more abstract, like almost an idea. And this idea cared about me, though. It was an idea, had pragmatic application. I could see why that works. It doesn't mean it's true. I had this pragmatic application of a thing that watched over me, that cared for me and wanted success for me, wanted good. It wanted all the things I wanted for me. Isn't that interesting? So that made me realize people around. I didn't have this control God who thought, in my view, it was deterministic, that others were damned for hell predeterminately. Like he had certain people who were reprobates from the beginning and others who weren't. And I guess who they were or want to, because the human tendency of wanting to know what God knows. Anyway, long story short, my relationships became healthier. My balance in life became better in terms of how I function, what I do, what I do with my time, everything. So I can relate to that. And if I was still a theist, that perception of God would have had me be totally cool. If you'd have met me as this presup, reformed Calvinistic guy, you might have been like, he's nuts. He's nutty. He's obsessive about theology and Jesus and debating every night and reading the next book and, all this kind of stuff. And my relationship with my wife wasn't even healthy. So I can relate, even if we both have different understandings about God today, or even disagree on that. So Williams, great super chat. And thank you for always being here. Sorry to ramble, but I had to give a little more. Grays, we have two more and then we're going to let you go. I hate that it took us this long, but thank you for your time. Do you have any thoughts on Islamic Neoplatonism?
I don't know anything about Islamic Neoplatonism, I don't think, unless I'm forgetting something obvious, but it's probably quite interesting. But there's a really great podcast called The History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps, right? Which is a crazy title, but it's this chap, I can't remember what he's called now. He's a good philosopher, history of philosophy guy. And that's where I might pull up one of those podcasts, because no doubt there'll be an episode. They're only like 15 minutes long, each of these episodes, because he's literally doing absolutely every basically every year in Western civilization, like what the philosophical ideas were at that point. So there'll be one on Islamic Neoplatonism, I'm absolutely sure. So I might go and listen to that later and see. But off the top of my head, I can't think of anything about it whatsoever.
You've won the vote of best plaid shirt for Philosophers
good.
Online, and then
Best
also
plaid shirt out of the two of us. Yeah, absolutely.
Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at YouTube Atheism. And then last one is Indo says, Craig explains math via God's desires, which are brute contingent. Oppie says, well, then math is brute contingent. Can Oppie's logic imply objects like dogs are brute contingent because dogs explanatorily regress to God's desires?
I don't know that I follow that question particularly well, but what I would say is William Lane Craig and Graham Oppie had a debate on Craig's argument from maths, right, which is that he thinks that mathematics implies that God exists. Obviously, Oppie doesn't think that.
Right.
And after they had that debate, I had Graham on for a kind of post-debate review. So we spent like 2 hours talking about the debate. So if you want to know more about what he said there, I guess you could watch that video on my YouTube channel.
Oh, you have a YouTube channel? Why didn't we?
I do. I'm not very good at promoting. And unlike you, who have a very industrious work ethic, I produce videos very infrequently and probably of awful varying qualities and stuff as well. But yeah, it's
Okay,
called
is it episode 19 Thoughtology?
Yeah, that's right.
Oh wow. Okay, I'm subscribing to your YouTube channel right now.
Okay, good.
And people can subscribe, and then when you do drop a video, they will show up. So that's how humble you are, man. You showed up and you were like, nah, don't share anything, don't worry about it. And I'm like,
well, it doesn't matter. It's not, I don't earn any money out of it. I don't monetize it in any way, so it really doesn't make any difference to me if anybody watches it or not. I like talking about philosophy, and seeing as I'm not doing that for a living at this point, it's quite nice sometimes to just, have a little chat with some world-leading philosopher. I mean, you must understand this idea. You talk to world-leading academics all the time, right? That's your hobby and livelihood, I suppose, in your case. But seeing as I earn a living in a different way, I don't have to worry about promoting it or doing it frequently or anything like that.
It's my job to worry about that for you then.
Okay, that's cool. You can be my agent.
I'll tell you what I'm trying to do. I want to create a community of thinkers. I don't want all of us to think the same. I'm glad. That's why I get people get irritated. Why are you interviewing Richard Carrier? He's a mythicist. Most scholars think Jesus existed. I think the guy's sharp in many ways. I love learning from him and hearing from him. And he's entertaining as well, like you said. Mm-hmm. I don't agree with him on the Jesus question. He could be right, though, but I don't agree with him. I think it's less likely, in my view. But like the point is having guys come on and having you chew me out on an idea, not chew me out, but you know what I mean? Like say, hey, I'm pushing back. I'm not buying until I have more good concrete data to work on. So this has been a heck of a show. I've enjoyed it. I hope it lives up to its title. Maybe that's a bit clickbaity. But to end on a positive note, back on presuppositionalism, as we're leaving, your advice to someone who might be on a call-in show, who might be forced to have to engage in some way with this kind of game, I'll call it. What is your advice to them when presubs come in and challenge them again? You're saying they're making a claim. God must be there for logic. God must be there for math. You explain intelligibility, whatever the claim may be without God, right? What would you recommend them do?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's I think what I'd recommend that they do is like spend absolutely decades of their life mastering all of the philosophical nuances, but that's really absurd, right? But that's what's required to just find those conversations effortless. Otherwise, they're going to be quite difficult, right? So it's like playing a game of chess against a grandmaster, playing their favorite opening or whatever. You're not going to have an easy time. It's going to be very difficult unless you're a grandmaster too. You're probably going to lose, right? So don't think you have to win. Just try and focus in on they're making a claim. At the end of the day, they're advocating for an argument. Like when you had that conversation, Jay Dyer actually said, oh, I just made the transcendental argument. It was like this like mic drop moment or whatever, where he's like, I already made the argument or whatever. And I was thinking, well, I don't hear any premises, I don't hear any inference or anything. Like, what was the inference rule that you used to derive the conclusion from the premises? I don't hear any of that stuff. So if anyone's trying to claim that they're making this type of argument, I would just ask them for the details, like explain it. Don't get sidetracked into you explaining something. Like, at the end of the day, let's just, it might even be worth saying, let's just suppose my view is completely incoherent, right? Let's just suppose that's true. Still, how do you defend the premise? Like, what's going on? And it doesn't matter. You don't get to win an argument just because your interlocutor is an idiot. That doesn't mean you win. You could still be wrong, even if your opponent is the stupidest person in the world, even if they do have an incoherent worldview. That still doesn't mean that you've proved anything, right? It just means that this guy is an idiot, but it doesn't mean that you're right. So if you're going to make an argument, you have to back it up. It doesn't matter if it's a transcendental argument, right? Trust me, my PhD was in metaphysics, but basically like an overlap between like logic and metaphysics. And like, there is no type of argument. It's an indirect argument or it's a transcendental argument or whatever. There is no type of argument where you don't have to support the premises of it, right? No one can tell you that it's like, all I have to do is show that your worldview is wrong. That's not true. There's no argument that works like that. If you're making a claim, maybe I'm wrong, but you still have to justify what you're saying. So that's the thing. You have to just sort of have a good awareness of that dynamic and try and keep track of the ball, right? Don't watch the player, watch the ball, keep your eyes on it. And you might notice when they try and shift the burden over to you, and you can say, no, buddy, that's not my problem. Doesn't matter if I don't have an explanation for maths, because you still haven't justified the premise. So let's just go back to that. And this is why sometimes it just turns into this kind of macho thing where it's just like, no, you say this. No, you say this first before I say this. And it's not really an open discussion. It's kind of a stupid argument, right? But that is one of the things that you're going to have to do if you want to hold your own in a conversation like that, especially if they don't know you and they're going to be disrespectful.
Right. It's so funny. You started to get into like how it really goes. It gets really bad really quickly. And there's some advice for me if I ever have to have that conversation, which I don't want to. I don't even like having this. But that guy's video, that the title's similar to what we made this one. It sounds like he's making the jump to try and make the claim, oh, it's scripture. And then when the guy's like, that doesn't do anything for me. You haven't proven anything. So what about scripture that makes this somehow this thing? And the guy never, I mean, I'm 20 minutes into it. I didn't watch the whole thing, but so far he's like, he's dropping the juggle. He's not even answering that question. He's dodging it. He's avoiding it. He's distracting. And it's like, because then once you get to scripture, once you get to text, golly, we have completely different observations about this material. And so, as you know, that's my game. You're now in my field. And that's why I think they always want to avoid going into that field as much as possible, because I have good argumentation. I have good reasons for the claims that I'm actually bringing forward, whether you agree with them or not. And so at the end of the day, you would just, if there was an honest interlocutor and they're not being disrespectful, I feel like we'd walk away with just, we agree to disagree and we have different worlds completely, and it would be respectful. I've not found that though most of the time. I imagine it's just Darth Dawkins types, right?
Yeah. And that's just, he's just an asshole, that guy. There's no point even talking to him. But like there is, on the one hand, we talk about all this like sort of fallacious burden shifting and like gaslighting or whatever. Right. On the other hand, look, there is a reasonable point to be made here about like, if you are interested in being into discussing religious ideas like this, if it's historical, if it's philosophical, whatever, and you're an atheist, it is reasonable to consider the philosophical questions like, epistemological questions or like even metaphysical questions, because you might be presupposing some particular view, right? Like you might be presupposing some kind of naive scientism, or a criteria of epistemology whereby, the only way to find out knowledge on any subject is through sense perception and testing, right, and something like that. And you might find that actually that's quite naive, and because you've never thought about it before, you don't really see how naive that actually is. And all you're doing is focused in on like the empirical details of biology or something, but you never reflect on the philosophical aspect to it. There is a decent critique to be like, your game, it's like having one really strong left hand and a really weak right hand or something. Like there is some like argument to be made. You should like balance it up. You need to do a bit of philosophical work to be a more well-rounded thinker or something. And like Presup picks at that kind of scab. You know, if you've never done any philosophy before, you're particularly vulnerable to this. So like you can work out by doing a bit of philosophy, reading a bit of stuff, you know, getting your philosophy game up a bit. It will just make you a more all-round kind of debater or thinker or whatever. So I mean, yeah, there is some kind of like legitimate critique of people who are too one-sided anyway.
Right.
So I'm not saying there's nothing like of any value in these questions. If you bang on about logic all the time and you don't know the difference between realism and conventionalism, intuitionism or something, but you talk all the time about logic, then there's something a bit weird about that. And you might want to look into it one day. But it doesn't mean you have to make your mind up completely. It's just that there's something out there. There's philosophy overlaps with everything. So if you don't know anything about it, there's loads of the world you've never thought about before. Anyway.
You've just made a good case on why people should get into philosophy. And I, over the years, hope to be better acquainted and read up on this. I must admit, I'm not as into it. It's not a topic I'm at specifically. We all do it, but I'm saying the topic, the specific, I'm going to go down into philosophy as a study. It's something I will be doing over time, I'm sure, and it helps sharpen my mind. I enjoy listening to some of the great minds that are philosophical, but you know, I'm hoping and encouraging people, if this is your kind of shtick, you know, get into it. If you like what you heard, get into it. If you already are in the ballpark, then you already know what the game is. So thank you so much. Subscribe to his YouTube channel.
Or don't. It's up to you.
Or don't. It's up to you. But you don't want to have eternal conscious torment. And we know what happens if you don't subscribe. So notice I just did a little sophistry there, I think. Being manipulative a little. Now, is there anything you want to say to our audience? Is there anything they should subscribe to, go to?
No.
Thank you again.
Cool. It was enjoyable. Thank you for having me.
You are a very fun, and I really enjoyed thinking with you and you helping me think about my own shortcomings, my own places I haven't thought about, or potential places I need to think about for my own future. And thank you for being someone who's a good teacher. I appreciate you.
That's a very nice thing to say. So I really appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful day. Look forward to more content. Subscribe to both of us, so when he drops on a blue moon another video, you can check him out and let him know Myth Vision sent you. Thank you so much. And never forget, we are Myth Vision.